It was an unusually hot day in Washington, D.C. when Sergeant Malik Davis, a black U.S. Army soldier, stood tall in his uniform, immovable as ever, at the front of the White House. The changing of the guard ceremony was always a highly anticipated event. The crowd, a mix of tourists and locals, surrounded the perimeter of Lafayette Park, eager to witness the solemnity of the occasion. With each meticulous movement, each synchronized step, Malik held the dignity of his role close, feeling the weight of history in the small but important task he had been entrusted with. His heart, steady as ever, had long learned to navigate the complexities of his position. A black soldier in an institution as storied and prestigious as the U.S. Army Guard, Malik had faced more than his share of prejudice, skepticism, and outright disdain over the years. But today, as he stood before the hundreds of onlookers, he was resolved not to let anything disturb the rhythm of his duty. Yet, as the ceremony proceeded, Malik's sense of composure was tested in a way it never had been before. A woman in the crowd, middle-aged with a sharp, aggressive demeanor, began shouting at him. Her voice pierced the calm air like a dagger, drawing attention from the surrounding tourists. "Look at you," the woman sneered, her tone laced with venom. "What are you even doing here? You don't belong in that uniform. You don't even belong here, in front of the White House." The words were not unexpected. He'd heard them before in various forms from various people over the years, remarks designed to belittle, to question his worth. But something about the woman's open mockery in front of the crowd made the words sting in a way they hadn't before. Malik kept his face as impassive as he had been trained to do. He was a soldier. His duty was to stand, to remain still and unwavering. The taunts continued, growing louder, more biting. But he kept his focus, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "Yeah, you're not even American. You probably don't even know what this country stands for," the woman continued, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "You should be ashamed of yourself. You think you're important, but you're just a pawn in a system that doesn't care about you." Behind her, a few people looked uncomfortable. Some began to glance away, trying to avoid the uncomfortable scene unfolding before them. Others, still not fully understanding the depth of the insults, merely watched with curiosity, not knowing how to respond. But for Malik, the words were not new. They were a reflection of a reality he had lived through since childhood. From the classrooms to the streets, to the army barracks. These were the constant whispers, the insidious, dehumanizing remarks that sought to strip away the dignity he had worked so hard to build. Every day he fought to prove that he was more than the sum of those words, more than the label others tried to place on him. As he stood firm, his resolve unbroken, another figure emerged from the crowd. Malik could see a security guard making his way over, trying to diffuse the tension. The guard, a young man, approached the woman and gently told her that she needed to step back, that her behavior was inappropriate. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might calm. The crowd shifted, uncertain of what would happen next. But then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, the woman gestured to a young boy beside her, a teenage nephew. "Lucas." She turned to him and said something under her breath that Malik couldn't quite make out. But the boy's expression twisted into one of mischief. Without hesitation, Lucas took a small bag of peanuts from his pocket and, encouraged by his aunt, began tossing them in Malik's direction. One by one, each peanut was a silent accusation, a deliberate provocation. It wasn't the act itself that hurt, but the symbolism behind it, the idea that Malik was still seen as less than, still just an object of ridicule in the eyes of some. The crowd stirred, some gasping in shock, others unsure of how to react. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Malik could hear his own heartbeat, steady, insistent, as if reminding him to breathe, to keep going. His mind raced, memories flooding in of childhood encounters with racism, of the weight of expectations he carried as a black man in the army, of how much he had sacrificed to earn this place. The insult felt personal. And for a fleeting moment, his control over his emotions wavered. His fists clenched. His chest tightened. But he held his ground. It was then that something shifted. The woman, seeing that Malik had not reacted to her provocations, took another step forward. This time more aggressively, as if determined to break him. "What are you going to do? Stand there like a statue forever?" she jeered, her words dripping with contempt. It was then that Malik realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something far bigger, the battle against a culture of hate that had festered for far too long. His pride, his heritage, his identity as a man and a soldier were being tested in this moment. It wasn't just a test of his patience, but a test of everything he had believed about dignity, about resilience, and about the power of silence in the face of prejudice. But despite the rawness of the moment, despite the growing pressure in his chest, Malik didn't react. Not yet. He knew that his role was more than just standing still. His role was to embody something greater, to show those around him that the strength to endure, the strength to withstand the cruelties of others, could be a powerful form of resistance. Still, deep inside, Malik felt the heavy toll of this battle, a battle not just for respect, but for a place in the world that so often tried to push him to the margins. His eyes, though focused outward, were a window into the internal struggle. A struggle that he carried with him every day, unseen but ever present. As the seconds stretched, the noise from the crowd began to fade, the insults growing more distant. He had not given in. Not today. And yet, the weight of those words would linger, for a time, testing the depths of his patience, his pride, and his unshakable dedication to the uniform he wore. The tension in the air was palpable. The woman's insults continued to hang in the atmosphere like a thick fog, threatening to cloud everything. Malik stood there, unmoving, his face stoic. But inside, a storm was brewing. He had faced racism before, in many forms, subtle, direct, insidious. But there was something about the sheer audacity of the woman's behavior today that stung deeper than the usual insults. The fact that she seemed to relish in the cruelty of her words only amplified the weight of her hatred. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd, some expressing discomfort, others simply watching in confusion, unsure of what was unfolding before them. It seemed as if the woman's persistence only made her bolder, and it wasn't long before she made her next move. Without warning, she began to approach the rope barrier that separated the crowd from the soldiers. She pushed past the security guard who had earlier tried to intervene, ignoring his attempts to stop her. Malik's heart rate quickened, but his stance remained resolute, his eyes never wavering. He had been trained for moments like this, where threats came in all shapes and sizes, but he had never imagined the line would be crossed in such an open, brazen way. The woman, now standing directly before him, glared up at him with a mix of disdain and triumph in her eyes. "You're nothing but a puppet," she spat, her breath hot against his face. "And it's time someone reminded you of that." Malik's muscles tensed, but he did not react. His years of training told him to hold his ground, to stay focused, to not let his emotions guide his actions. But then, in one swift and unexpected motion, the woman raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the silent air, shocking the crowd into a stunned silence. Malik's head snapped to the side with the force of the blow, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The sting on his cheek was sharp, but it was the insult of the action, the direct challenge to his dignity, that hit him harder than the slap itself. The woman stepped back, her eyes wide with false innocence, as if expecting some sort of reaction, some form of retaliation. But Malik, shaken as he was, did not give her the satisfaction. He stood there, his body rigid, his breath steady but his heart pounding in his chest. He had endured so much worse. And yet the moment of physical contact felt like the most invasive of all. The crowd, sensing the shift in the energy, started to murmur among themselves. Some whispered in disbelief, while others simply stared, unsure of how to respond. Malik's training kicked in. His thoughts clearer now. His role was not to fight back. He was a soldier. Not just for the army, but for a greater cause, one that transcended this moment. His resolve, however shaken, was not for himself alone, it was for the dignity of his position. For the honor of the uniform he wore. But then, the chaos that Malik had been trying to avoid began to unfold. The woman, emboldened by the slap, began to shout again. Louder this time, with even more venom. See, this is what happens when you let people like him have power. He thinks he can just stand here and take it. He's no better than a statue. Malik's breath caught in his throat. The whole scene felt surreal. Like something from a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. He was caught between two worlds, the composed, professional soldier who had learned to shut out the noise, and the raw, human man who had endured years of hurt, of subtle slights, of deep-seated racism that had never truly gone away. For the first time, Malik found himself questioning his own resolve, wondering if it was worth it to hold everything inside anymore. And yet, as the woman's words grew more venomous, something inside him snapped. His training, his discipline, and everything he had ever believed in were being tested in that one moment. He was not sure how much longer he could endure. Before he could make a decision, a security guard who had been standing off to the side, clearly in shock, finally moved to intervene once more. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The line had been crossed. And Malik, for the first time in his career, felt a surge of emotion, anger, frustration, humiliation, all blending into something far more powerful than he had ever anticipated. The air around Malik was thick with tension, and his heart was still racing in the aftermath of the slap. He stood frozen, a myriad of emotions swirling inside him. The echoes of the woman's words reverberated in his mind, her taunts growing louder with every passing second. But beneath the anger and the humiliation, there was something far more unsettling, doubt. Had he done enough to maintain his composure? Had he let his guard slip too far? The very notion of it made his chest tighten. A part of him wanted to lash out, to strike back, to make her understand the depths of the pain she had inflicted. But another part, the part trained to control, reminded him of the cost of such a response. As he stood there, his body tense and rigid, he saw Major Hall, his commanding officer, approaching from the crowd. Major Hall had witnessed the entire exchange from the sidelines, and Malik could already see the disappointment etched on his face. The gaze between them was heavy, and Malik felt as though the weight of the world was bearing down on him. There was no turning back now. Sergeant Harrington, Major Hall's voice rang out, a quiet authority in the midst of the surrounding chaos. Step away from the crowd. Now. It was not a suggestion, it was an order. Malik, still numb from the shock of what had just occurred, obeyed mechanically. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him as he moved. Some sympathetic, others judgmental. But it didn't matter anymore. The uniform he wore, the pride he once felt in being part of the Royal Guard, everything seemed so distant now. As though he had been stripped of his identity in that one fleeting moment. Major Hall led him to a quieter part of the grounds, away from the prying eyes of onlookers. The security guard, who had been trying to control the situation, followed them closely, but even in the relative privacy, the silence between them was suffocating. Major Hall folded his arms across his chest, his expression unreadable. For a long while, there was only the sound of the distant murmurs of the crowd, slowly fading as they spoke in hushed tones about what had just transpired. Sergeant, Major Hall began, his tone measured, but there was an edge to it. What happened back there? Malik swallowed hard. trying to steady his breath. She slapped me. Sir, he said quietly. His voice barely carried the weight of the events. She insulted me. And I couldn't take it anymore. I let it go too far. Major Hall's eyes softened. But his words were stern. You let your emotions get the better of you. In this line of work, that can never happen. You're a symbol. Sergeant. Your composure is just as important as the uniform you wear. It's not just about keeping peace, it's about the example you set. Malik felt his stomach drop. He knew this was coming, he had let his guard down. And now there would be consequences. Major Hall's disappointment was palpable. And Malik couldn't escape the crushing weight of guilt that seemed to close in around him. You've shown great resilience throughout your career. But today, you crossed a line. We can't afford to lose that composure. Not even for a second. Major Hall continued. His voice softer now. I'm going to have to relieve you of your post. You're suspended from duty while we conduct a review of the incident. Malik felt as if the ground had been swept out from under him. Suspended. It wasn't just a reprimand, it was a blow to everything he had worked for. He had spent years enduring the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racism that came with his position. He had fought hard to maintain his dignity in a world that often stripped it away. And now, it felt as if all of that hard work had been undone in an instant. Sir. Malik began. His voice barely a whisper. I didn't want to lose control. But the things she said, they're not just words. They're a lifetime of hurt. It's hard to stay composed when people think they can treat you like that. Major Hall nodded slowly, his expression softening. I understand. Sergeant. I do. But we cannot let that dictate our actions. You've made mistakes. But that doesn't define you. You're a good man, Malik. And I know you can bounce back from this. The words were meant to be comforting. But they felt hollow. Malik was filled with a profound sense of loss. Of something slipping through his fingers. He had always believed in the value of resilience. Of doing what was right. No matter the cost. But in that moment, standing before Major Hall, he felt something more human. Something raw regret. As Major Hall turned to leave, offering a final, understanding glance, Malik stood there alone, reflecting on the gravity of the situation. It was no longer just about a single incident, it was about what it meant to serve. To hold on to one's identity while being torn down by the weight of prejudice. The days of unquestioning loyalty to his post seemed distant now. And as he watched Major Hall walk away, Malik was left to grapple with the personal cost of trying to be both a man of honor and someone who simply wanted to be treated with dignity. This wasn't the end. He knew. But it was a moment. A turning point. One that would leave scars. Jim had always prided himself on his professionalism. As a member of the American Ceremonial Guards at the White House, he was not just a soldier, he was a symbol of pride, dignity, and tradition. The weight of his uniform was something he wore with honor. He knew the history it represented. And he understood the eyes of the public that often watched him with a mix of awe and curiosity. But today, all of that seemed irrelevant. Lost in the aftermath of what had just transpired. The changing of the guard ceremony had been routine until Haley had arrived. At first, he had tried to ignore her. People sometimes didn't understand the importance of the ceremony, and their loud comments and attempts to get a reaction were nothing new. But Haley's taunts, sharp and biting, were different. She was deliberate in her cruelty, intent on getting under his skin. At first, Jim had kept his distance, relying on the lessons of his training to remain stoic. However, it became impossible to ignore her. Her voice had grown louder, the insults more direct. And when she had thrown peanuts at him, Jim felt the surge of anger rise in him like an uncontrollable tide. He could feel the heat on his neck, the pressure in his chest. Every fiber of his being told him to remain calm, to keep his composure. But it was hard. She didn't just mock his uniform, she mocked his very being. When Haley crossed the line and slapped him across the face, something inside him snapped. Years of discipline, of holding his tongue, of enduring the quiet slights and whispers, came crashing down in that one moment. Jim's training had failed him. He had allowed his emotions to dictate his actions. The slap had been a clear violation of his professional boundaries. The sting on his cheek was nothing compared to the overwhelming shame he felt as he raised his hand to stop Haley from advancing further. For a split second, he had lost control. And in doing so, he had violated everything he stood for. The moment felt suspended in time. But the reality quickly began to set in. Major Hall had arrived. The disappointment evident in his eyes. Jim had seen that look before when someone had gone against protocol. When a soldier had faltered in their duty. But this wasn't just a lapse in procedure, this was a crack in his sense of self. In everything he had fought for in his career. Sergeant Williams. Major Hall's voice was sharp. What happened here? Jim stood there, numb, trying to find the words. The crowd had gathered around them, whispering, muttering about the scene they had just witnessed. In the midst of it all, Haley continued to play the role of the victim, pointing at Jim, shouting accusations of brutality. Jim could feel the weight of her words even though he knew they were lies. But it didn't matter. To the people watching, it was his actions that would define him. I lost control, sir, Jim replied, his voice barely above a whisper. She insulted me, mocked me, and I reacted. Major Hall's gaze softened for just a moment. But the harshness returned quickly. Sergeant, you're suspended. Effective immediately. We'll review the incident and determine the next steps. Jim felt his stomach churn. Suspended. Just like that. A career. A lifetime of service. Hanging in the balance because he had allowed his emotions to dictate his actions. It felt like a betrayal. Not just of his uniform, but of everything he had worked so hard to build. The walk back to the guardhouse felt endless. Jim's mind raced, consumed with questions. What would this mean for him? For his future in the guard? And more importantly, what had this all really been about? Was it just the insult? Or was it something deeper, the cumulative weight of years of discrimination? Of being treated as less than? Of carrying the burden of others' prejudices in silence? As he passed the gates, Jim saw the faces of onlookers, some still whispering, some offering nods of sympathy, others pointing fingers in judgment. He felt exposed. Naked in a way that had nothing to do with the uniform he wore. His pride had been shattered. And the silence that followed was deafening. Jim sat alone in the small break room. The weight of the suspension sinking in. His mind kept returning to the moment Haley slapped him. He could still feel the sting on his cheek. And it wasn't just physical. It was a reminder of how easily the world could strip him of his dignity. And that realization, how easy it was for people to hurt him without consequences, made him wonder how many others had endured the same things in silence. Haley's actions had been abhorrent. But his own had been just as damaging in their own way. What was it that made him lose control? Was it the years of being treated as less? Of never being seen as equals? The weight of systemic racism was not just in the words spoken, but in the daily interactions. The unspoken biases that plagued the world. But there, in that quiet room, Jim knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done. This suspension wasn't the end of him, it was just a moment, a difficult, painful moment that he would learn from. The questions about his worth and his place in the guard would have to wait. For now, he would focus on understanding the true cost of service. Not just the uniform, but the humanity behind it. Jim's suspension had weighed heavily on him. Every hour felt like a reminder of his failure, his lapse in control. But the days dragged on. And eventually, the sharp sting of anger dulled into a more profound ache, an ache not just from the suspension, but from the realization that he had let someone break him. The truth was, Jim had always prided himself on standing tall. But now, as he walked through the city streets without his uniform, he felt small. His actions had painted him in a new light. And it was a light he didn't want to acknowledge. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One morning, as he was walking through a small park, he saw a familiar face. It was Daniel, Haley's nephew, the boy who had tossed peanuts at him during the changing of the guard ceremony. The boy, who had been caught in the whirlwind of his aunt's cruelty, now stood alone, looking lost and frightened. The sight of him stirred something inside Jim. A flicker of empathy, of compassion. Despite his bitterness toward the family, he couldn't just walk past the boy. "Hey!" Jim called, his voice hesitant but firm. Daniel looked up, his eyes wide. But there was no recognition in them. No anger. Just fear. Jim had expected that. The last time their eyes had met, it had been during the most volatile moment of his career. Daniel must have been confused, caught in a conflict far too mature for his age. "What are you doing here?" Jim asked, stepping closer. Daniel shrugged, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way to escape the conversation. I don't know," Daniel stammered. "I was trying to find my aunt." Jim paused, his heart softening at the boy's vulnerability. He had seen the cycle of cruelty Haley had created. But this was different. This was a child, caught in the middle of a storm he hadn't created, left to navigate a world he didn't fully understand. Jim didn't know why he did it, but he found himself asking, "Do you need help finding her?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Jim could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the weight of fear on his small shoulders. He was just a kid. After all. The walk to Haley's apartment was silent, but not uncomfortable. For once, Jim wasn't thinking about his suspension or the sting of Haley's words. He was thinking about Daniel, about the pain that must have been simmering beneath the surface for him. The boy had been complicit in his aunt's cruelty, but there was something else, something broken in his expression, that made Jim wonder whether he, too, was a victim of her hate. When they arrived at the apartment, Haley wasn't home, but Daniel's uncertainty remained. Jim could see how lost the boy was. The vulnerability that came from living under the shadow of someone like Haley. The woman who had targeted Jim had also created a toxic environment for her own nephew. "You don't have to stay here if you don't want to," Jim said gently, his voice filled with more empathy than he had expected to feel. "You know, you don't have to follow your aunt's lead. There are other ways to live. Ways that don't involve hate." Daniel looked up at him, the words clearly confusing but also oddly comforting. There was a long pause before Daniel spoke again. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice small but sincere. "I didn't know she was like that." Jim didn't respond right away. There was so much more to say, so much more to teach. But at that moment, he realized that it wasn't just about him. It was about breaking the cycle of hate, of passing down wisdom to the next generation. And for the first time in days, Jim felt the weight on his shoulders shift. It wasn't gone, but it was lighter. Later that day, Jim returned to the guardhouse to face Major Hall. The investigation into the incident had concluded, and Jim was anxious about what would come next. But when he walked into Major Hall's office, the mood wasn't what he had expected. Sergeant Williams. Major Hall greeted him. "I've reviewed the incident, and I must admit, I'm impressed by your actions today." Jim's mind raced. Impressed? How could that be? "You've made a difficult choice." Major Hall continued. "You didn't have to help that boy. But you did. And you showed that the values of our guard aren't just about standing at attention in uniform. It's about integrity, even when things get tough." Jim swallowed hard. He had expected punishment, further reprimand. But what he was hearing now was something completely different. It was respect. It was recognition for the deeper values that defined who he was. Not just his uniform. "We're not just looking for soldiers," Major Hall said, his voice thoughtful. "We're looking for individuals who understand that strength comes from doing the right thing, even when it's difficult." That boy, Daniel, is at a crossroads. What you did today, helping him, may have just helped him find a better path. You've done more than just uphold your duty as a soldier. You've reminded us all that service isn't just about wearing a uniform. Jim felt a swell of pride, a quiet understanding settling in. He wasn't just a guard. He was part of something bigger. Something that could change lives. Even in the smallest of ways. His actions had consequences. But they also had the power to heal. This was the true meaning of service. As Major Hall offered him a second chance to return to duty, Jim knew that, despite the struggles, he had found his way again. And, just like that, his heart began to heal, too. The days following his meeting with Major Hall were a mixture of reflection and quiet optimism for Jim. When he had been relieved of his post, he had thought that perhaps his career was over, that his lapse in judgment would forever tarnish his reputation. But as he walked back through the familiar gates of the guardhouse, now with a sense of renewed purpose, he realized that redemption wasn't just about regaining his uniform. It was about rediscovering the core of who he was, his sense of duty, integrity, and compassion. The Royal Guard wasn't just an institution, it was a living embodiment of the values of service. The respect that came with the uniform, the discipline, the commitment, it all depended on the actions behind the uniform. Jim had always believed that. But the events of the past few days had made him confront it in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about standing still and looking imposing. It was about facing the difficulties of life head-on and making choices that reflected strength of character, not just physical prowess. Jim stepped into the guardhouse, his boots echoing on the stone floor. Major Hall was waiting for him, a rare smile on his face. Sergeant Williams. Major Hall greeted him warmly. "I wanted to personally welcome you back." Jim nodded, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't that he wasn't grateful, it was just that he didn't feel he had earned it. Not fully. There was still so much to prove to himself, to the people around him, and to the legacy he wanted to leave behind. But he didn't need to say it. Major Hall, reading the hesitation in his eyes, placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know this hasn't been easy," Major Hall said quietly. "But what you've shown us, what you've shown yourself, is that strength comes in many forms. You've learned, just as we all do, that redemption doesn't happen overnight. But it does happen." Jim swallowed the lump in his throat. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to feel this deeply, but in that moment, he did. The weight that had been pressing on his chest since the incident with Haley was starting to lift. The actions that had felt like a betrayal were now beginning to feel like lessons learned, lessons that would guide him through the rest of his service and beyond. The next few weeks passed quickly. Jim returned to his post with more than just a sense of pride, he returned with a new understanding of the importance of his duty. The uniform he wore was still a symbol of strength. But it had evolved. It was no longer just about authority, it was about responsibility. It was about showing others the way. Even in the smallest of gestures. He thought often of Daniel, the young boy who had been so lost, so caught in the chaos of his aunt's cruelty. Jim's heart ached for him. And yet, he found comfort in the fact that Daniel had seen a different side of life, a side of kindness, of integrity. He hoped that in the years to come, the boy would remember that brief moment of compassion and perhaps choose a better path. The next time Jim saw Daniel, it was a surprise. He was walking down the street, heading toward the guardhouse when he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Daniel, standing hesitantly outside a coffee shop. He looked older, a bit taller, his eyes softer. He saw Jim and froze for a moment. But then his face broke into a tentative smile. I wanted to thank you," Daniel said, his voice quieter than before, "for helping me that day. It meant a lot." Jim smiled, a warmth filling him that he hadn't expected. "You're welcome, Daniel. I'm glad to see you're doing well." Daniel nodded, shifting on his feet nervously. "I know I wasn't perfect. I'm trying to do better." I'm not going to be like her. The words hit Jim deeply, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. But then he simply said, "That's all anyone can do. Just do better. Each day." They stood there for a moment, neither of them saying anything. But the weight of the moment was understood. Jim realized that this was it, this was the real reason he wore the uniform. To be a guiding light. Even in a small way. For those who needed it. Later that day, when Jim returned to the guardhouse, Major Hall approached him again, a knowing smile on his face. "You did good work today," Major Hall said. Jim nodded. But it wasn't just because of his uniform or his service. It was because he had learned the real value of strength. It wasn't just in how he stood, but in how he showed up for others. And for the first time in a long time, Jim truly believed that his work, his service, was not just for the moment, but for something greater.